You're not going to believe this story. It's from the Arizona Territory, way back in 1881, a time when the desert was more likely to offer you a grave than a helping hand. It's about an Apache widower, a woman on the run, and two kids who stumbled into a fight for their lives. They thought they were just looking for a safe place to sleep. They found a war instead. If this story gets your heart pounding, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Let's get into it. The sun in the San Pedro Valley doesn't just shine, it punches. It was beating down on Nanton Vale's bare back as he pulled his mare to a stop. The air smelled of dust and sage, the scent of a land that was beautiful and deadly all at once. He was out on the fence line, where his small patch of earth met the endless, rocky foothills of the Huachucas. The wire was sagging, a clear invitation for coyotes, and the summer monsoons had turned the ground soft, pulling posts loose like rotten teeth. Nanton swung down from the saddle. The creak of leather was the only sound besides the low moan of the wind. Years under this sun had baked his skin a deep brown gold. A single hawk feather was tied into the long, black braid that ran down his back. As he bent to work, the light caught a wicked-looking scar along his ribs, a pale, jagged line against his dark skin. He'd gotten it 10 years ago, back when he scouted for the army, a life he never talked about, a life he tried every single day to forget. Suddenly, his mare's ears shot up, pointing like daggers toward the old wagon track. Nanton went still, every sense on high alert. Out here, you learned to trust a horse's fear before you trusted your own eyes. He looked, seeing nothing but the heat shimmering off the baked dirt. But then, through the haze, he saw it. Two figures moving slow, deliberate. A woman and a small boy. They were on foot. That was the first alarm bell. Nobody walked in this country unless they had no other choice. And people with no choices often carried a world of trouble right on their shoulders. The woman's dress was faded and caked with dust. The boy clutched a battered satchel like it was the only thing he had left in the world. Nanton finished with the post, his movements economical and quick. He swung back onto his mare and guided her toward them. He didn't rush. Sudden moves out here could get you killed. When he got close, the woman looked up. Her eyes were a pale, startling gray, and they looked like they'd seen way too much. She stopped walking, planting her feet in the road like she was daring the world to try and move her. "Afternoon," she said, her voice raspy from thirst. Nanton just nodded. "You're a long way from anything." Her eyes darted past him, toward the thin line of cottonwood trees that marked his ranch, then back to his face. "Been walking since yesterday. Our wagon broke an axle." She paused, then added the part that really mattered. "The driver we hired, he took the horse and left us before sunrise." "That's so." Nanton's voice was flat, giving nothing away. He looked at the boy. His boots were falling apart, the sole on one flapping with every step. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were sharp, darting from Nanton to the mare, then back again. "We just need water," the woman said, "and maybe a dry place to sleep. We can work for it." Nanton looked her over. She didn't flinch under his gaze. She had grit. Life had either given it to her or beaten it into her. There wasn't much difference in the end. "Name?" he asked. "Caroline Mercer. This is my son, Jamie." The boy gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. Nanton tilted his head toward the trees. "My place is yonder. You'll find water there. The barn's got space." She nodded once, a sharp, curt movement of someone who'd stopped expecting kindness long ago. "We won't be any trouble." He turned his mare and started walking, not looking back to see if they followed. He knew they would. They had no other choice. As his small adobe house came into view, he saw his daughter Annie sitting on the porch. She was about 11, her dark hair braided just like his. She was working on a leather rope, but her hands went still the moment she saw the strangers. Her eyes, dark and serious, like his own, locked onto Caroline, then onto Jamie. It was the silent, instant judgment of a child sizing up a potential threat, or a potential friend. "This is my daughter Annie," Nanton said over his shoulder as he dismounted. He led his mare to the water trough. Caroline and Jamie stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, two dusty statues in the fading light. Annie stared at Jamie, and for a second, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Barn's round back, Nanton said, breaking the silence. Water in the trough. There's a pump inside if you need more. We'll sleep there, Caroline said, her hand resting on Jamie's shoulder. Thank you. Nanton didn't answer. He just led his horse into the cool shadows of the barn. He could hear their footsteps behind him, the scrape of worn-out boots on the hard-packed earth. He didn't watch them settle in, but he heard the big barn door creak open. He told himself it was just for one night. He was wrong. It was the beginning of everything. That night, the desert cooled off fast. Nanton sat just inside the open barn doors, the familiar scent of leather and oil filling the air as he worked on a saddle. Lamplight cast long, dancing shadows. From his bench, he could see into the cavernous space where Caroline was settling Jamie down on a pile of clean hay. The boy was already half asleep as she covered him with a thin, patched blanket. She glanced over at Nanton, her face impossible to read in the gloom. For a split second, he wasn't looking at her. He was seeing his wife, Sunny, tucking in a much younger Annie on a cold winter night. Sunny, gone 3 years now, taken by a lung fever that had swept through like a wildfire, leaving nothing but ashes and silence. The memory was a physical ache in his chest. Without a word, Nanton stood up. He grabbed a thick wool blanket from a peg on the wall. He also picked up a small cloth sack with some roasted corn and a tin of jerky inside. He walked over to the edge of the light, setting the items down on the floor just inside the barn, a silent offering. He didn't want to hand them to her directly. That would feel too much like something he wasn't ready for. Thank you, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He was already walking away, back toward the small house that had felt empty for so long. Inside, Annie was at the table, a small carved wooden horse in her hands. They staying? She asked, not looking up. For the night, he said. Annie set the horse down. It was a toy their grandfather had carved for her, one of her few treasures. She looked at her father, her expression serious. His boots are worse than the ones you made me throw out. Nanton felt the corner of his mouth twitch. It wasn't a smile, not quite, but it was something. Eat your supper, he grumbled. Later, with the moon hanging like a sliver of bone in the black sky, Carolyn sat wide awake, her back pressed against the rough wood of the barn wall. The desert night was alive with sounds, the yip of a distant coyote, the hum of insects. She thought about the road behind them, the shattered axle, the face of the man who had left them to die. She thought about all the doors that had been slammed in her face over the past year. This silent, scarred man, Nanton, hadn't asked a single question. He'd offered water and shelter, that was it. She couldn't decide if that made him a good man or just a cautious one. Out here, they were often the same thing. She pulled the thick wool blanket tighter around her shoulders, the one he had left without a word. She closed her eyes, but she didn't sleep. She listened. She waited. Sleep was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not yet. The next morning, the sky was the color of a fresh bruise, just before the sun bled over the horizon. Nanton was already up, but when he stepped outside, he saw Caroline was already at work. She'd found an old broom and was sweeping the barn floor, her movements efficient and strong. She wasn't waiting to be told. She was earning her keep. He saw Jamie by the chicken coop. Annie was with him, pointing and talking in a low voice. And then Nanton heard it, a small, sharp burst of laughter from the boy. Caroline heard it too. She stopped sweeping for a second, her back to them, but Nanton saw her shoulders tense, as if she was physically holding on to the sound, memorizing it. He realized then that it had probably been a long, long time since she'd heard her own son laugh. He walked past them, not saying a word, and knelt by a patch of earth near the house. He pulled a handful of dark, wrinkled seeds from his pocket. Tepary beans. His mother had taught him how to plant them. They were tough, resilient. They grew where everything else withered and died. What are those? Caroline's voice startled him. She had walked up behind him, silent as a shadow. Tepary beans, he said, pressing them into the soil. My people's food. Good for winter. There was a note of pride in his voice he rarely let anyone hear. These beans were more than just food. They were a connection to his past, to his blood. They were survival. Later that day, Nanton hitched a wagon and drove into the nearby town of Charleston for supplies. He didn't ask her to come. He needed to think. He needed to know who he had let onto his land. In town, the storekeeper, Ezra Cobb, a man with eyes that missed nothing, watched him buy flour, salt, and nails. Nanton noticed Ezra's gaze linger on the extra sack of beans. But what really set Nanton on edge was when he went to buy a small pair of boys' boots. Ezra bagged them without a word, but as he handed them over, he leaned in close, his voice a low rumble. "Heard Cole Ransom's crew is back in the territory, Nanton. Riding with a new brand, a coiled snake." Nanton's blood went cold. Cole Ransom, a name from a past he had buried deep, a ruthless outlaw he'd tangled with during his scouting days, a man who left nothing but death in his wake. Ezra's eyes flickered with meaning. "They say he's looking for something, or someone, a woman." Nanton's face remained a mask of stone. He paid for the goods, loaded his wagon, and turned back toward the ranch, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. He didn't know who Caroline Mercer was. He didn't know what she was running from, but he had a terrible feeling he was about to find out. He arrived back at the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and red. He left the new boots by the barn door, just like before, a silent offering. He saw Jamie find them. The boy's eyes went wide with a kind of desperate joy that tore at something deep inside Nanton. He caught Caroline's gaze across the yard. He saw the question in her eyes, the suspicion. She knew this wasn't just simple kindness, but she didn't know the half of it. That night after the kids were asleep, Nanton found her by the corral. The air was cool, carrying the first hint of autumn. "The man who left you," Nanton said, his voice low and hard. "The wagon driver. Describe him." Caroline tensed. "Why?" "Just do it." She looked away toward the dark line of the mountains. Tall, scrawny, a tattoo on his wrist, a snake coiled up. There it was, the confirmation he'd been dreading. The coiled snake, Ransom's brand. This wasn't a coincidence. The broken wagon, the abandoned woman and child, it was all connected. They hadn't just stumbled onto his land. They had been sent or driven. "You're in trouble, Caroline," he said, his voice flat. She finally looked at him, and for the first time, he saw the raw, naked fear she'd been hiding so well. "You have no idea," she whispered. But Nanton was beginning to think he did. He looked out at the vast, dark expanse of the desert that surrounded them. It was no longer just a wilderness. It was a hunting ground, and he had just invited the prey right into his home. The quiet rhythm they'd started to build was shattered. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. Caroline grew withdrawn, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Nanton started carrying his rifle with him everywhere, even just to go to the barn. The unspoken tension was a poison, seeping into the air, and the children felt it too. Annie grew quiet and watchful, sticking close to her father. Jamie's brief flicker of laughter was gone, replaced by a familiar, haunted look. One afternoon, Nanton was sharpening an axe, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, the only sound in the yard. Caroline approached him, her hands twisting in the fabric of her apron. "You know his name, don't you?" she said. "Cole Ransom." Nanton didn't stop his work. Scrape, scrape. "I know it." "Then you know what he is." Her voice was shaking. "You should make us leave. It's not your fight." He finally stopped, looking up at her. His eyes were hard. "He left his brand on your driver. That makes it my business. What did you take from him, Caroline?" Her face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Men like Ransom don't hunt people for sport. They hunt for profit." "What did you take?" Tears welled in her eyes, tears of frustration and fear. She shook her head, backing away. "You don't understand." "Then make me," he shot back, his voice rising. "Because right now you've brought a war to my doorstep, and I don't even know what we're fighting for." She turned and fled, disappearing into the barn. Nanton was left standing in the silent yard, the axe in his hand feeling heavier than it ever had before. He was protecting a woman who wouldn't trust him, a woman with a secret so dangerous it could get them all killed. That night a storm rolled in, not of rain, but of wind. It howled through the cottonwoods, rattling the doors and windows. In the middle of the night, Nantan was jolted awake by a sound that wasn't the wind. It was the frantic whinny of a horse from the corral. He grabbed his rifle and was out the door in an instant, moving silently through the darkness. The moon was hidden by thick clouds, and the wind was so loud it was impossible to hear anything else. He reached the corral, his eyes scanning the shadows. The horses were bunched together, their eyes wide with panic, and that's when he saw it. The gate was open, not just unlatched, but wide open. Someone had been here. He checked the horses, running his hands over them, checking for injuries. They were spooked, but unharmed. But then his hand brushed against the flank of his mare, and he felt something sticky. He hurried back to the house, lit a lantern, and went back out. In the flickering light, his blood ran cold. Painted crudely on the mare's side in what looked like pig's blood was a single, terrifying symbol, a coiled snake. It wasn't a raid. It was a message. I was here. I can get to you whenever I want. I can touch what's yours. He heard a gasp behind him. Carolyn was standing at the edge of the light, her face a mask of horror. He knows we're here, she whispered, her voice trembling. He's been watching us, Nantan said, his voice grim. He looked from the symbol on his horse to Caroline's terrified face. The game had just changed. This wasn't about waiting for a fight anymore. Ransom was playing with them, enjoying their fear, and Nantan knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the game was about to turn deadly. The bloody snake on the horse changed everything. The fragile truce between Nantan and Caroline, built on unspoken needs, was now fused by a shared immediate terror. The question of her past was no longer a matter of his curiosity. It was a matter of their survival. That morning, as he scrubbed the dried blood from his mare's coat, he spoke without looking at her. The time for secrets is over, Caroline. Today, right now, or you and the boy will be on your way by noon. His voice was flat, hard as stone. There was no room for argument. She finally broke. They sat at the rough-hewn table inside the adobe house, the door shut tight against the world. Annie had taken Jamie down to the creek, a desperate attempt at giving them a moment of childhood before the storm broke. He's not just my son's father, Caroline began, her voice a low, ragged whisper. He's a monster. Cole Ransom isn't just an outlaw. He runs a gang, the Coiled Serpents. They rob stagecoaches, banks, but their real money comes from fear. They take over small towns, bleed them dry. They killed my parents when I was 16 because my father was the town's sheriff and wouldn't bend. Nantan listened, his face unreadable. He'd heard whispers of the serpents for years, a plague on the territory. He never knew Ransom was their leader. He took me after that, she continued, staring at her hands. Said it was his right. For years I was his property. The night Jamie was born, I saw the look in Cole's eyes. He wasn't looking at a son. He was looking at his legacy. Another monster to raise in his own image. That's when I knew I had to run. But I couldn't just leave. I had nothing. No money. No one to help me. She finally looked up, her pale eyes burning with a desperate fire. So I took the only thing he cared about more than himself, his ledger and his map. Nantan leaned forward. Map to what? Everything, she breathed. Every dollar he ever stole, every cache of gold, every hidden strongbox, all marked on a map he'd spent years making. It's his whole life, his power. I thought it was my only leverage, my only chance to buy my son a new life, far away from him. She reached into the lining of her skirt and pulled out a small oilskin-wrapped packet. She laid it on the table between them. It was the key to their destruction, or their salvation. Nantan stared at the packet, then back at her. And the wagon driver? He was one of Ransom's men. I paid him to take us west, but I think he recognized me. He must have sent word to Cole. He took the horse and our supplies, but I managed to keep the map hidden. He left us to die in the desert, figuring the coyotes would do his job for him. Now it all made sense. The broken axle wasn't an accident. It was a trap. It was Nantan's turn. He looked at the jagged white scar on his ribs. 10 years ago, when I was scouting for the army, my patrol stumbled on a serpent camp. We weren't prepared for what we found. They were a small army. They slaughtered my unit. I took this scar from one of Ransom's lieutenants. But that's not all I lost that day. His voice dropped, thick with a pain that time had not healed. My wife, Sunny, she was with me. We weren't supposed to be there. She was visiting the fort. When the shooting started, they didn't care who she was. They shot her down. He closed his eyes for a moment. I killed the man who did it, but Ransom, he got away. I've carried that day with me ever since. The room was silent. The story wasn't just Caroline's anymore. It was his too. Ransom hadn't just come for her. He had brought Nanton's own ghost back with him. This wasn't just about protecting a woman and a child. This was about vengeance. He won't stop, Caroline whispered. He'll burn this place to the ground to get that map back. Let him try, Nanton said, his voice a low growl. He opened his eyes and the grief was gone, replaced by something much harder, much colder. It was the look of a warrior. This is my land. He took my wife from me. He will not take my home. He will not take my daughter. And he will not take your son. He stood up and walked to the wall where an old heavy Winchester rifle rested on two wooden pegs. He took it down, his movements sure and steady. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a scout again, a hunter. We're not going to run, he said, turning to face her. We're going to prepare. We're going to turn this ranch into a fortress. And when he comes, we'll be waiting. This ends here, one way or another. The fear in Caroline's eyes was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. A flicker of hope, a spark of defiance. For the first time since she'd arrived, she wasn't just a victim on the run. She was a soldier in a war she finally had an ally to help her fight. The days that followed were a blur of frantic, focused work. The ranch transformed. Nanton was no longer a quiet man of the earth. He was a master of strategy, his Apache heritage and his time as an Army scout flowing back into him like a river returning to its bed. He walked the perimeter of his property not as a rancher checking fences, but as a commander surveying a battlefield. He'll come from the ridge, he told Caroline, pointing to the high ground to the north. It gives him the best view. He'll think he has the advantage. He spent a full day in the rocky outcroppings below the ridge, working with a quiet, deadly intensity. He used rope and timber to create rock falls, balanced precariously, ready to be triggered by a single, well-aimed shot. He dug deep pits along the main path, filling them with sharpened stakes and covering them with a thin layer of brush and dirt. They were invisible, and they were lethal. He brought Caroline to the barn and handed her a heavy Colt revolver. Her hands shook as she took it. I've never fired a gun, she stammered. You'll learn, he said simply. Annie already knows how to handle the small rifle. When they come, you will not be helpless. You will fight. He set up targets, old tins and bottles, on a fence post and spent hours with her, teaching her how to stand, how to aim, how to control her breathing. The first few shots went wide, the recoil jarring her, but she didn't give up. Fueled by a desperate will to protect her son, she practiced until her arms ached, until the smell of gunpowder was ingrained in her clothes. She learned. Even the children's fort, the small, rickety structure they had built from scraps behind the cottonwoods, became part of the plan. Nanton reinforced it with sod and rocks, cutting a small hidden peephole into the back wall. It's a perfect fallback position, he explained. Low to the ground, good cover from the creek bed. Annie and Jamie watched, their game of make-believe suddenly turning terrifyingly real. One afternoon, as Nanton was showing Caroline how to reload the Winchester quickly, Jamie fell while running near the creek. He scraped his knee badly, a deep, ugly gash. Caroline cleaned it, but the boy seemed off. He was listless, his face pale. By evening, he was shivering, wrapped in a blanket despite the warmth from the hearth. By morning, he was burning with fever. Caroline was frantic. It's the cut, she said, her voice tight with panic. It's gotten infected. But Nanton looked at the boy, at the strange, bluish tint to his lips, at the way his breath came in shallow, rapid pants. He'd seen this before. In the territories, raiders and outlaws sometimes used a slow-acting poison derived from a rare desert plant. It mimicked a fever, slowly shutting down the body. It was a cruel, cowardly weapon. He knelt beside Jamie, his face grim. This is not a normal fever, Caroline. He left and returned moments later with his leather satchel of herbs. He mixed a poultice and applied it to the cut, but he knew it was a token gesture. He looked at Caroline, his eyes dark with the terrible truth. Ransom, he said, his voice barely a whisper. This is his work. The wagon driver. He must have given Jamie something. Something in the water or the food before he left you. Caroline stared at him, horror dawning on her face. This wasn't a random illness. It was a time bomb. A cruel, calculated move to flush her out, to make her desperate enough to come crawling back to Ransom for a cure. Is there anything you can do? She begged, tears streaming down her face. Nanton pulled out a bundle of dried leaves. This is yerba santa. It will help his breathing. It will slow it down. But it won't cure him. The antidote requires a root that only grows on Black Creek Peak. A full day's ride from here. A full day's ride there, and a full day's ride back. Time they didn't have. Ransom would be upon them long before he could return. The trap had been sprung. Ransom wasn't just coming for his map. He was coming with the cure for her son's life in one hand, and a death sentence for all of them in the other. Jamie's shivering breaths filled the small house, each one a tick of a clock that was rapidly running out. They were trapped, with no way to get the cure, and a full-scale assault just over the horizon. Ransom had them exactly where he wanted them. The sight of Jamie, pale and shivering under the blankets, lit a fire in Caroline. The fear that had paralyzed her for years burned away, leaving behind a hard, cold rage. She looked up from her son's bedside, her eyes meeting Nanton's. There's no time for you to ride for that route, she said, her voice steady and clear. He'll be here before you could even get to the foothills. I know, Nanton replied, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. Then he has the antidote, she continued, a terrifying logic dawning in her mind. He poisoned Jamie because he knew I'd do anything to save him. He expects me to come to him, to trade the map for the cure. He expects you to walk into his camp alone, Nanton finished for her. It's a trap. You'd give him the map, and he'd kill you both anyway. I know, she said again, but this time her voice was different. It wasn't the voice of a victim. It was the voice of a predator. He thinks I'm still the scared girl he can control. He's expecting me to be desperate. He's not expecting me to be dangerous. A plan began to form between them, spoken in short, clipped sentences. A desperate, almost suicidal gamble. He'll send a rider, Nanton reasoned. A messenger, to tell you the terms of the trade. That will be our only chance. They didn't have to wait long. The next afternoon, a lone rider appeared on the ridge, a white flag tied to his saddle horn. He rode down slowly, his hands held high. Nanton met him at the gate, rifle held loosely but ready. The man was one of Ransom's thugs, his face arrogant and cruel. Ransom sent me, the man sneered. He knows the boy is sick. He feels generous. He's got the cure. He'll trade it for what was stolen from him. The woman brings the map to Hangman's Canyon at sundown. She comes alone. And if she doesn't? Nanton asked, his voice calm. The man's smile was ugly. Then the boy dies, and Ransom and his 20 men will come here and burn this place to the ground anyway. He gets the map one way or another. This way, the woman at least gets to watch her son live for a few more minutes. Nanton nodded slowly. Tell him she'll be there. The rider laughed, turned his horse, and galloped back toward the ridge. As soon as he was gone, Nanton and Caroline moved with lightning speed. Annie, Nanton called. His daughter appeared, her face pale but determined. You know the plan. You take Jamie to the fort. You do not come out, no matter what you hear. You understand me? No matter what. Annie nodded, her eyes wide. She helped Caroline carry the feverish, semi-conscious Jamie out the back and down to the small reinforced shelter by the creek bed. They bundled him in every blanket they had. I love you, Jamie, Caroline whispered, kissing his hot forehead. Mama will be back soon. Then she and Nanton went back to the house. Caroline changed, not into a riding skirt, but into a pair of Nanton's old trousers and a dark shirt. She tied her hair back tightly. She looked like a different person. She looked like a warrior. Nanton handed her the oilskin packet containing the map. This is the real one. Give it to him. It has to be convincing. Then he handed her another smaller packet. This is a decoy. It's just a piece of blank parchment. Keep it hidden. He then took a small leather pouch from his belt. It was filled with a fine dark powder. This is from my grandfather. Pulverized hornets' nests and dried peppers. Throw it in a man's eyes and he'll be blind for an hour. He gave it to her. Finally, he held out the heavy Colt revolver. She took it, her hand now steady. He'll search me, she said. He'll be looking for a gun on your hip or in your hands. He won't be looking for one tucked in the small of your back. He helped her secure the weapon, hidden by the loose shirt. The writer said he has 20 men. They'll be waiting in the canyon. But Ransom, he's arrogant. He'll meet you himself. He'll want to see the fear in your eyes. That's your moment, when you hand him the map. What about you? She asked, her heart pounding. Nanton's face was grim. He picked up his own rifle and a bow with a quiver of arrows. Silent, deadly weapons his father had taught him to use. I'm not going to the canyon, he said. A faint, dangerous smile touched his lips. I'm going hunting. He slipped out the back of the barn, a ghost in the fading light, melting into the landscape. Caroline took a deep breath, mounted Nanton's fastest horse, and rode toward Hangman's Canyon. She was riding into the lion's den, armed with a single gun, a packet of dust, and a plan that had almost no chance of success. She was the bait, and she could only pray the hunter was as good as she thought he was. The ride to Hangman's Canyon was the longest of Caroline's life. The setting sun cast long, blood-red shadows that looked like grasping hands. Every rock, every cactus, seemed to be a hiding place for one of Ransom's men. She rode with the reins loose, the horse picking its own way through the treacherous terrain. She felt strangely calm. The terror had burned itself out, leaving only a cold, hard resolve. As she entered the narrow mouth of the canyon, the temperature dropped. The high, rocky walls blocked out the last of the light, plunging her into a gloomy twilight. She could feel eyes on her, dozens of them. Up ahead, a bonfire roared, casting flickering light on the canyon walls. Around it, she could see the silhouettes of men, at least 15, maybe more. They were armed to the teeth, rifles glinting in the firelight. And standing alone a few feet in front of the fire was Cole Ransom. He hadn't changed. He was still lean and sharp, his dark hair falling across his face. He watched her approach, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his lips. He thought he had won. He thought she had come crawling back. She dismounted, her boots crunching on the gravel. She walked toward him, her heart hammering against her ribs, but she kept her face a mask of weary defeat. Caroline, he said, his voice a low, mocking purr. I knew you'd come to your senses. It took you long enough. Where is it, Cole? She said, her voice flat. The antidote. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Business first. The map. Let me see it. She slowly reached into her saddlebag and pulled out the oilskin packet. His eyes locked onto it, greedy and possessive. She walked forward, holding it out. You came alone, he stated, his eyes scanning the darkness behind her. Smart girl. Where's the Apache? He wanted no part of this, she lied, her voice laced with false bitterness. He threw me out, said my trouble wasn't his to die for. Ransom's smirk widened. Even a savage knows when to cut his losses. Now the map. She held it out. He reached for it. As his fingers brushed against hers, she let it drop to the ground. It was the signal. As he instinctively bent down to grab it, her hand shot to the small of her back, pulling the heavy Colt. In the same fluid motion, her other hand grabbed the small pouch of blinding powder. Ransom looked up, the map in his hand, his eyes widening in shock as he saw the gun in hers. But he was too late. She threw the contents of the pouch directly into his face. He screamed, a raw, animal sound of pain and rage clawing at his eyes. Get her! He shrieked. But in that split second of chaos, a silent arrow flew out of the darkness from the canyon rim above. It struck the man closest to Ransom, burying itself deep in his chest. He crumpled without a sound. Another arrow. Another man down. Ransom's men were in chaos, firing wildly into the darkness, not knowing where the attack was coming from. Caroline didn't hesitate. She fired the Colt, not at Ransom, but at the lantern hanging from a nearby pack mule loaded with ammunition crates. The lantern exploded, igniting the oil and showering the crates with fire. The ammunition started to cook off, a deafening chain reaction of explosions, sending shrapnel and bullets flying in every direction. Men screamed and dove for cover. The bonfire was kicked over in the panic, plunging most of the canyon into darkness, lit only by the hellish glare of the burning supplies. Caroline dove behind a large boulder as bullets whizzed past her head. The canyon had become a death trap. From the rim above, Nantan's rifle barked. Each shot found its mark. He was a ghost, moving from rock to rock, never firing twice from the same spot. Ransom's men, blinded, confused, and caught in their own crossfire, were being picked off one by one. Ransom, still half blind and gasping, stumbled through the chaos, firing his pistol wildly. "It's a trap! Kill her! Find the Indian!" he roared. Caroline saw him trying to get to his horse. She knew he still had the real map, and more importantly, he had the antidote. She couldn't let him escape. She broke cover, running through the smoke and confusion. A bullet grazed her arm, a searing hot pain, but she ignored it. She saw Ransom fumbling with his reins. "Cole!" she screamed. He spun around, his eyes red and swollen, tears of pain streaming down his face. He raised his pistol. She raised hers. They fired at the same time. A hammer blow struck her in the shoulder, spinning her around and knocking her to the ground. Her vision swam, but as she fell, she saw Ransom stagger backward, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. He dropped his gun, clutching at the wound, a look of utter disbelief on his face. He stumbled, fell to his knees, and then pitched forward into the dust. He didn't move again. Silence descended on the canyon, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the moans of the wounded. Nantan slid down the scree slope, his rifle in his hand, his face grim. He ran to her side. "Caroline!" "I'm all right," she gasped, clutching her shoulder. "The antidote! Get the antidote!" He knelt by Ransom's body. He found a small sealed vial in his coat pocket. He also found the oilskin packet with the real map. He tucked them both safely away. He gently helped her up. "We need to go. Now." They mounted up, leaving the scene of carnage behind them. As they rode out of the canyon, the first drops of a cold rain began to fall, hissing on the dying embers of the fire, washing the blood from the stones. They had won, but the race against the poison was far from over. They rode through the night like furies, the cold rain soaking them to the bone. Caroline clung to the saddle horn, the pain in her shoulder a dull, throbbing fire. But her only thought was of Jamie. Nanton led the way, his face set like granite. They burst into the small adobe house, dripping water and mud onto the floor. Annie was there, waiting, her face a mess of tear tracks and terror. She had heard the distant gunshots. "He's worse," she sobbed, pointing to the small bed where Jamie lay. His breathing was dangerously shallow, his skin cold and clammy to the touch. Nanton didn't waste a second. He uncorked the vial and carefully poured a few drops of the dark liquid between Jamie's lips. Then they waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the drumming of the rain on the roof and Jamie's faint, ragged breaths. Caroline knelt by the bed holding her son's small hand, whispering his name over and over. Nantan cleaned and bandaged her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. And then it happened. A flicker of Jamie's eyelids, a small cough, a deeper breath. The color began to slowly return to his cheeks. The fever was breaking. He was going to live. Caroline collapsed forward, her head resting on the edge of the bed, and wept with a relief so profound it felt like pain. Nantan placed a hand on her uninjured shoulder, a silent gesture of comfort that spoke more than words ever could. They had faced the monster, and they had won. In the days that followed, a fragile peace settled over Cottonwood Draw. A traveling marshal, alerted by the storekeeper Ezra Cobb, who had grown suspicious, came to investigate the slaughter at Hangman's Canyon. Nantan told him the truth, leaving out nothing. He handed over Ransom's ledger, the map, and the names of every corrupt official on the outlaw's payroll. The marshal, a weary but honest man, looked at the fortified ranch, at the woman with her arm in a sling, at the 2 children playing by the creek, and made his decision. "Sounds like self-defense to me," he said, closing his notebook. Cole Ransom and his crew have been a blight on this territory for a decade. You ask me, you did the world a favor. He tipped his hat and rode away, officially closing the book on the Coiled Serpents gang forever. Life began to find a new rhythm. The traps were dismantled. The rifle was put back on its pegs above the hearth. But something had fundamentally changed. The house was no longer just Nanton's shelter. The barn was no longer just Caroline's refuge. It was their home. One evening as the sun set, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, Nanton found Caroline on the porch. She was watching Annie and Jamie, who were laughing as they skipped stones across the creek. He stood beside her, not speaking for a long moment. Then he held out his hand. In his palm was a simple bracelet, carved from a single piece of dark mesquite wood. Mesquite, he said, his voice quiet. It bends, but it doesn't break. It grows in the hardest ground. I thought it fit. Caroline looked from the bracelet to his face. The hard lines around his eyes had softened. I don't just want this place to survive anymore, Caroline, he said. I want it to live. I want to hear laughter that isn't just a memory. I want to be the man who comes in from the cold and finds you here. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time, they were not tears of fear or sorrow. She held out her wrist, and he slipped the bracelet over her hand. It felt solid. It felt real. It felt like a promise. A few weeks later, with the cottonwood leaves turning a brilliant gold, Mrs. Ortega, the midwife from the valley, came to the ranch. There was no preacher, no fancy ceremony, just the four of them, and an old friend, standing under the shade of the trees that had given their home its name. Nanton and Caroline spoke simple words that sounded more like a treaty than a prayer, a promise to stand together, to protect what they had built out of ash and blood. That night they all sat on the porch, watching the stars come out in the vast dark sky. Jamie was curled in Caroline's lap, fast asleep. Annie leaned against Nanton, her head on his shoulder. Nanton reached out and took Caroline's hand, his fingers lacing through hers. Home, he said quietly. She squeezed his hand, looking out at the peaceful land they had fought so hard to claim. Home, she agreed. They had walked through the fire, and on the other side, they hadn't just found survival. They had found each other. Thank you for staying with me through that entire story. It's stories of courage and second chances like this that remind us what it truly means to fight for a family. If you enjoyed this journey, please show your support by hitting that like button, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss the next incredible story I have to share.